Afternoon, everyone. My name is Ara McCauley. I'm the Artistic Director of Kingston Writers Fest, and I'm pleased to present The Voice of Ghosts. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which the festival customarily takes place and where I am today is traditionally the territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We gratefully acknowledge these Indigenous nations for their ongoing guardianship of this land. We agree to peaceably share in responsibility for stewardship of this land, its waters, and all of its biodiversity. All those who come to work here and live here are responsible for honoring these relationships in a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'd like to thank the Canada Council, Canadian Heritage, Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Kingston and Kingston Arts Council for their ongoing support of the festival. We're grateful to those organizations and individuals who support us. In particular for this event, I would like to thank Jennifer Foster, the author patron for Kim Echlin, and Harriet Waterman, author patron for Judith McCormack. As a thank you for your continuing support of Kingston Writers Fest and for joining us for the virtual edition of the festival, we will randomly select a pre-registered participant of this event following our Q&A to receive a copy of the author's books. We will do this for each onstage event throughout the festival. This event is 1 hour long and includes a question and answer period. Feel free to type your questions in the question box, which is located at the bottom of your screen at any point during the event. If you'd like to support the authors by picking up a copy of their books, our official bookseller Novel Idea has copies available to purchase in store, by phone, or online. Now I am delighted to introduce this event's moderator, Hal Wake. Hal Wake has been engaged with the literary community in Canada for more than 30 years. In the mid-80s, he was the book producer for CBC's Radio Morningside with Peter Zosky. He has hosted or moderated more than 100 literary events at festivals in Vancouver and Victoria. He is the former artistic director of Vancouver's Writers Fest, a position he held for 12 years, was the chair of the Canada 2020 Literary Program Committee for the Frankfurt International Book Fair, and is a current Writers Trust board member. Please welcome Hal.
Thank you very much, Ara. And I have to say that Kingston is one of my favorite festivals. I've been to the festival in person at least a couple of times. And I hope that we'll return to the day when we can all convene in person sometime before too long. So it's my great pleasure to host this event. Two genocidal conflicts 60 years apart are the launching point for the novels Speak Silence by Kim Echlin and The Singing Forest by Judith McCormack. How do we understand our seemingly endless repetition of inhumanity? What do we do with that knowledge? And how can we use it to prevent further horrors are central themes of the novels in our discussion today. And as Ara said, we'll talk for about 45 minutes and then there'll be ample time for your questions, and I'm sure you will have many. First, let me introduce Kim Echlin. Kim Echlin is the celebrated author of 7 previous books. The Disappeared was shortlisted for the 2009 Scotiabank Giller Prize. And about Speak Silence, her new novel, Slavenka Drakulic wrote, between 1991 and 1995, an estimated 60,000 women were raped in wars in the former Yugoslavia. But the women did not allow these rapes to become an historical footnote. They witnessed their ordeal in The Hague's International Tribunal. And thanks to these women, the world understood for the first time rape as a weapon of war and found the accused guilty of a crime against humanity. The carefully researched and well-crafted novel based on these true events is an impressive monument to the women. Judith McCormack has several law degrees, which, as she says, have mostly served to convince her that law is a branch of fiction. Her writing has been shortlisted for the Writers Trust Fiction Prize, the Commonwealth Fiction Prize, the Journey Prize, and the Amazon First Novel Award. Her fellow panelist, Kim Echlin, said this about The Singing Forest. The Karpaty mass grave near Minsk, Belarus, was used to hide the bodies of thousands murdered by Stalin's secret police from 1937 to 1941. Searingly, as McCormack writes, there are the voices of the dead who cry out, we are here, we are waiting. Know this history through your heart, through that empathetic imagination of McCormack's fiction. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Hal.
Judith, I guess you owe Kim an endorsement. You don't have to make it up on the spot. These books are sadly well matched in their plumbing of, to a great degree, of the depths of human evil, I guess. And we've got lots to delve into in the novels, but I want to begin with perhaps a broader question. How important do you think the act of bearing witness is? Judith? You're muted, I think, Judith. Still, there
Sorry.
you go.
Okay.
There you go.
Critically important. I mean, if nobody knows about it, or if few people know about it, I guess it's one of those, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one to hear it kind of questions. So I think the idea in both these books of witnesses coming forward is, critical, but also an act of great bravery and courage in both cases. And so that's part of it, is that they are, making the past into the present. Their stories are falling from the past into the present, and they're changing the way we look at things, and they're changing even the sort of relationship with time. I can't say strongly enough how important witnesses are, and how valuable it is when they come forward.
Kim, this is a central theme for you, bearing witness and getting the truth out.
Yeah, I think the idea, Judith, I completely concur with you, especially in your analysis of time and how to bear witness today is to bring both the past and the future together and to make a future possible. But I also think that bearing witness is a fundamental human responsibility and a fundamental characteristic of being human, because and we can do it in our daily lives. It doesn't have to be to the great historic events. It can be to the things that we are engaged with day by day, and I think one of the things we learn as children is that if you are unwitnessed, or if you are unable to witness to, a friend or a family member, then those acts do go without meaning. And I think a very important thing that we can do in our daily lives is to acknowledge that we're in a constant process of bearing witness, as we've seen in Canada, in recent years, as we are engaging with things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the Black Lives Matter movement, or all of the BIPOC initiatives. To bear witness is to be able to listen, to be able to hear the other person's story and to hold it. And I think that it is absolutely critical to an international community.
And Can I just add something to that, Hal?
Please.
One of the things they did at Kurapati, which is the forest outside Minsk, where the Stalin secret police killed up to 250,000 people in the early 30s. One of the things that the people around there did, they were all terrified. And so nobody talked about it. But one of the things they did do is they dug up some of the bodies, some of the freshly buried bodies, and posed them by the road, reading newspapers and doing other things like that, just as a way to say, this is happening. There are bodies here, so that was their sort of way of trying to bring this to people's attention.
And
that's so, oh, sorry, Hal. This is our Zoom problem, jumping in on each other. But that I find, Yeah, Judith, I find that so interesting too, because I think the way we bear witness changes over time, and it changes with different groups and so on. So that story is remarkable to me. And so in Cambodia, after the Pol Pot time, skulls of people were gathered and put in large glass not cages, but boxes for people to observe at various memorials. And now that we're 3 generations past that initial point, the Cambodian people are rethinking how they want to bear witness. And the fact that they have a traditional belief that an unburied body means a soul that's still wandering the earth. And so they are now grappling with how to change these memorials to something that mirrors better or reflects better what they want, the way they want to bear witness now to their history. So it's in a very, this notion of bearing witness is a fluid one, which I think also is very human and part of our imaginations.
Judith, Kim introduces the notion in her novel that we readers reading the novel makes us witnesses in a sense, makes us. And then the question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Is that something that you agree with?
Well, I think that certainly the idea that the reader becomes a part of the story is certainly absolutely the case. It's a relationship like any other. The fact that it proceeds through the written word doesn't mean that it's less vibrant or less complex. So the idea that the reader is drawn in as a witness to this, I think, is very much the case. Yeah.
The historical events your books are based on are not obscure or unknown, and weren't when you set out to research them. So what drew your attention to those specific situations, and then what subsequently revealed their potential for fiction?
Do you want to go first, Judith?
Well, I guess in my case, this took place in Belarus, and my grandfather comes from Belarus. And Stalin also targeted Jews. He had a kind of odd relationship to the Jews. At one point, he thought they were kind of handy as administrators and so forth. And he actually, tried to, he issued a declaration against anti-Semitism. But then a few years later, he started targeting them, in part because they were members of the intelligentsia that he thought would be threats to his regime. So he went after them and he rounded up, large numbers of them, killed them, sent them to the gulag to starve or, die of disease and so forth. And so, half of my family is Jewish. I'm Jewish through my mother's side. So that was evocative for me as well. But I think that, they're known, but they're kind of underknown, I guess I would say. They're not unknown, but, I certainly didn't know very much about this when I started in on it. And, again, with Kim's book, I knew the very broadest of outlines, but it was an eye-opener for me.
Yes, Judith, I did not know about the specific events that you wrote in your book, and I'm glad to know them through fiction, because it gives me a more empathic connection to the material than reading straight history, which I also like. But the act of reading fiction is to say, I want to hear the voices of the people who were there. And in my case, I had watched the siege of Sarajevo on television, sadly, but at that time the Vietnam War and the wars in the former Yugoslavia were televised, and we were all watching them. And then I was talking to a documentary maker who had made a documentary on the International Criminal Tribunal. And I was absolutely startled at how little I knew about that tribunal, especially, Louise Arbour was one of the chief prosecutors, a Canadian. There were a large number of Canadians working in the courts, and I didn't know much about them. And when I started to explore it just to know more about the courts and discovered that there was a trial that absolutely changed the crime of rape in war for the first time in human history. For the first time, it was a crime against humanity as opposed to seeing women as spoils of war. I realized that this was a story that I really wanted to engage in because it is important for women around the world, not just in that particular war. And it really shifts the idea of what a woman is in war, whether it's that war or others around the world. So that was my starting point, was that huge transition that took place in the law, the new jurisprudence that came through.
Let's dig into the books a little bit. And I'd like you both to describe your protagonists and where they came from, or another way of saying that is how they found you, or another way is how you found them. However it happened, where did they come from?
You want to go first, Kim?
Okay. So there are two threads, or perhaps two protagonists in this story. There is the woman from Toronto, who is the woman who watches the war on television and becomes quite engaged with the war, not because of that, but because she has a lover from the region. And so she has a very personal interest in what happened in the region. But her counterpart in Bosnia is a woman who was inspired by a woman I met during my research. Her name is Bakira Hasecic, and she herself was a woman survivor of war. And when it was over, she, unlike many women who couldn't go home again, went back to Sarajevo and set up an NGO called the Women Victims of War group, in which she worked to collect funds for these women, because many of the women couldn't go home. Their families rejected them. Their families didn't know about what had happened to them. And also to bear witness, but in a legal way. She was a lawyer before the war, and she wants to prosecute still perpetrators who have not been prosecuted yet. So she provided a kind of very loose model for the woman that my Canadian observer engages with as a friend.
Judith.
Well, I have two protagonists as well. One is a war criminal. He's one of his story is interwoven with the story of the lawyer who's prosecuting. And so he has been part of the reason for thinking about him and bringing him into being was to try and explore more about evil. How does evil occur? How do people like this develop? And what do they think, and how do they feel? And trying to get more into that. But then there's the lawyer on the other side who's prosecuting him. And there's another thread running through that part of the story about her identity and how she's sort of reconciling, various strands of her identity, including being half Jewish, and what that means. I think that's something in particular that's useful, because often the images that we have of Jewish people are very traditional Jewish people. But in fact, 60 to 70% of North American Jews intermarry with non-Jews. And so Leah, my lawyer, is really kind of the wave of the future in some ways. And some of the turmoil that she goes through, trying to think about her identity this way, is indeed going to be, the turmoil that many people go through.
We'll return to the question of plumbing the depths of Žarko Dragic in your case, but and a different approach that Kim took. But back in the day when I started in this business, which was a century ago, you simply never asked writers about autobiographical elements. They just resented it because it was like, well, I'm imaginative, this is fiction. Now we've got the whole spectrum from auto fiction, everything in between. So I think it's okay to ask, what did you bring from your own lives into your characters or into the books?
Well, of course, sorry.
Go ahead, Judith. Go.
I was going to say, of course, I brought quite a bit of law into it. Who was formerly a lawyer. But it's law in the sense, it wasn't sort of the technical aspects of it. It was more the sort of law in a kind of literary sense. So my character, the lawyer, is, the things that she is sort of enthralled with or enchanted with about law tend to be things like, the doctrines, the doctrine of ripeness, the fruit of the poison tree, the spider in the web rule. These are, particularly the case law in law is very much a set of fables. And so, and a set of stories. And she has a sort of very sensual relationship, I guess, to law. And so, that's certainly something that, I contributed to her, shall we say.
And I love the daydream fantasy scene when she's in the courtroom and imagines, what is it, a flood coming?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
That's not your typical view of the law, Kim.
Yeah, I too loved the fact that your lawyer was such a storyteller and so engaged with people. I mean, I think so many of our professions are about storytelling. When you go to the doctor, you tell the doctor your story. When you go to the lawyer, you tell the lawyer your story, and out of that, then they do their professional work. But I mean, Richard Wagamese said, "All that we are is story," and this is so profoundly true. But for your question, Hal, I mean, the truth is that I bring everything to these characters, all of my experience. I mean, we can't inhabit the characters without bringing all of our emotions, all of the knowledge that we gather. On the sort of intellectual side, I mean, I read through these court documents, which are thousands of pages long, and sort of re-inhabited the people who were testifying their stories. And also a lot of them are available online, even in video format. So the International Criminal Tribunal is open to everybody, and it is meant to be a transparent process for the whole world to see. So if anyone's interested, just Google International Tribunal and you can read the transcripts yourselves, they're all available. But when you do that, you're taking all of your experience, and then you're asking yourself lots of questions, and you're asking the people who are then telling the stories to tell their stories to you, so that all of this material comes together.
Let me just carry on with you for a second, Kim. How do you, or did you deal with that emotionally as the research took you into really, really, really dark places and people telling firsthand stories, which is always different than the big broad picture about people. When somebody says and figuratively looks you in the eye and says, "This is my story," it can be pretty shaking.
Yeah. And when you are listening to someone tell their story, whether it's a story that's a war story or a more daily story, the difference between reading it and listening is the warmth. You're taking in the warmth of the person that you're listening to, and you're taking in all of their feeling, just as they're taking in some of yours, maybe. I did not ask women to repeat the stories from the war because they were very powerfully documented in the court transcripts, and there's a great deal of discussion in this community about not re-traumatizing people who survive. However, Bakira did talk to me about some of her stories. What I found very interesting, I asked the people who worked in the courts exactly the same question that you asked me, how did you cope listening to the stories and dissecting them day by day in the court? And I learned that there were different levels of feeling around working with the people who were testifying. But one of the most profound ones were the interpreters. Because they were sort of on the front line of hearing the stories, and they would hear the stories and have to do this instantaneous interpretation in the court of very, very difficult events. So there was no mediation for them. They were taking it in and then putting it out. And in fact, the interpreters don't last that long at the courts, even though they're very carefully timed in terms of how much time they spend there. But it is such an emotionally difficult job. And then the other people who were very affected by the work that they did were they called them witness assistants. And these people did everything from meeting the people at the airport to settling them in their hotel rooms. They usually had a hotel room on the same floor. They were available 24 hours a day. All of them spoke fluent, Serbian, Bosnian, Croatian. So again, they were kind of the frontline story listeners, and then would often interpret for the lawyers. And so, and they too didn't necessarily last very long in that work. It's very demanding.
Judith, talk a bit about your research and any sort of points where it was emotionally challenging, if indeed it was.
Well, certainly the stories of torture and death, that was very difficult. And I tried to only do a certain amount of that per day, and then tried to clear my head as much as I could afterwards. But I was also a bit concerned that, in the act of bearing witness in writing this book and so forth, that I wasn't, reducing my readers to despair, so I did try to make sure that the book would, include, many sort of beautiful passages and warm passages and happy passages and so forth, so that it would balance out some of the grimness of the research, so that it was, it was possible to read it and actually enjoy it. You might have to, read some of the parts very quickly to enjoy it, but certainly I was trying to, produce something that would be possible for people to take in.
Kim, did you have the same impulse?
And yeah, and if you don't mind, I want to jump in, because I do think that what redeems these stories for art is the beauty of the language. And Judith, that's in your book. And so I will follow beautiful language anywhere. And I can read very difficult events, and I can read lighter events if the language is beautiful. In a way, it is the mediation for me. And so I too, this is what I strive for. If I'm, no matter what I'm writing, I want the language to be as beautiful as I can make it. And I think that then holds the story in a way that makes it possible for others to engage with it.
Judith, you mentioned earlier, and I said I would come back to it, that you wanted to try to understand Stefan Drozd, how he came to be the person he was and was able to do the things that he did. Can you talk a bit about that process?
I have to say that even after thinking about it so much and researching it and reading books and all that stuff, I find it still very enigmatic. So, I mean, he did, as I said, have a brutalized childhood, and he was gradually, becoming dead inside, and certainly unable to feel for anybody else, although still quite, concerned about how people viewed him, and very much wanting to be accepted and admired and respected, essentially to kind of fill up the hollow parts of himself. But as one of my characters says, a lot of people have terrible childhoods and don't become mass murderers, and so there is an element there that I find very mysterious. And now in his case, he also talks about the fact that, that he, violence for him is a release. He says at a certain point that, when he was shooting people at Kurapati, he never felt more alive. That's a clue, I guess, to some of this as well. But there's, for me, I feel that there's quite a lot that, I still don't understand about it and that needs further exploration. Although I'm not sure my next book is going to be, on something like that.
Every time I read about even a murder in the newspaper, a sort of cold-blooded murder, I don't even understand murdering one person. The very thought of taking another person's life, there's crimes of anger, but a premeditated murder, I still don't even understand one person, much less multitudes. Kim, you decided, you went in the other direction. You've been fairly frank about how you felt you couldn't get inside Zarko Dragic's head. So how did you arrive at that point?
I too did lots of research on this and read perpetrators' accounts, although we don't have as many perpetrators' accounts as Judith will know too. I did write him, and I felt that it was inauthentic for me. I just couldn't get there. And so I decided that because
you did write him, what do you mean?
I wrote
from his
large
perspective.
Portions of the story from his perspective. And then I just decided to cut them because it just didn't feel authentic, and it was wrong for me to do that. So what I did was I just depended 100% on the trial transcripts. And in that way, he could reveal himself. The things that he decided to say in the trial, he could just reveal himself. And that had to be enough. The other thing was that this, to my mind, this story was about giving the women survivors voice. And so given that I couldn't get into the perpetrators' mindset, it felt like a further way to foreground their voices.
Mm-hmm. So we'll start to take questions in just a few minutes. I think I have a couple of questions left. So those of you who are attending this event, there's a little Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. You can put your questions in there, and they would be happy to answer them. They don't have to. What is it about Canadians, Canadian writers and Canadian writing sort of reaching out into the world? When I talk about Canadian literature, when I presume to talk about Canadian literature, I talk about the 70s as a time when our literature emerged and where our writers had to recreate this country imaginatively. And so, they did focus on the farms and the fishing villages and, urban Toronto and urban Vancouver and whatever, because they were saying, this place is real. We live here. Important things happen here. And now we're all over the world. Any ideas about what got us there, or what might connect us to foreign climes? Kim,
I think this is such an interesting question, and it's something like you, I've witnessed this over my lifetime. I mean, when I was a student, there were only a handful of writers published in Canada, Canadian writers published in Canada. There was Margaret Atwood, Timothy Findlay, Mordecai Richler. You can practically, and Margaret Lawrence, there were a number, but there was nothing like there is now. No. But I think that Canadians do come from all parts of the world. We hold the world's history here in a way that, for all of its faults, has many strengths. And I think that our view of ourselves is us Canadians who hold the world. I mean, we have a lot of literatures published in many languages here too, which is really fascinating because it means that people are telling the stories in the languages they know them.
And
What do
Judith,
you think, Hal? I mean, because you've watched this process too.
well, maybe later. I want to hear from Judith, of course, because you know, you had that personal connection to Belarus. So, but any other observations about the notion of us looking around the world and deciding to write about it?
Well, I guess I would echo what Kim says in the sense that in my book, the scenes go back and forth between Belarus and Toronto, and there's quite a lot in Toronto. So it's a way of, you know, bringing Belarus into Toronto and having Toronto spread out over the world as well. So it's you know, it's I guess a continuous interaction. I wonder, now I'm just speculating, I wonder if we feel a bit freer to do that, to be going out in the world, because a lot of those earlier writers did describe Canada to us, and it became, you know, it became something more real to us. It became something more visible, I guess, in a way that it hadn't before, all the different regions of Canada and so forth. And so that frees us in a way to go farther afield. But as I say, I'm just speculating.
No, I think that's a really critical observation because, and going back, Kim, to try to grapple with the question you asked, I remember talking to younger writers, beginning writers in the 90s, who didn't feel any obligation to write particularly about Canada. They could write about New York, they could write about an unnamed place, they could, because, and as Judith says, you know, in a way the base was built. You know, we didn't have to go back and continue to build that base. And I also echo your observation, Kim, that I love the expression, we hold the world. People come from everywhere and they tell their stories, and they bring that history and culture with them. I just want to end my little stupid soliloquy by I'm reading Andre Alexis' new novel, The Ring, and there have been lots of Toronto novels, lots of them. But my gosh, it is Toronto, Southwestern Ontario. And having spent some time in Toronto, you know, I just feel those streets, those bars, those restaurants, the people, the ambience. And what I'm curious about is what the rest of the world thinks of that. You know, we're so used to people talking about, you know, the Upper East Side or whatever, or London. But what do they think when they're reading about Toronto, Vancouver, Winnipeg, St. John's? I don't know. Any ideas?
You know, I'm totally curious about that too, because as you say, like, I fully accept New York street names, LA, Paris, London, all of these big cities. But I don't know whether Toronto is becoming more sort of, whether people know more about it or not. I have no idea. But there was a time when you couldn't mention a Canadian place name in a novel and get it published. And so this is the kind of cultural confidence that's emerged over the last half century or so.
Yeah, people change names the way they do in movies.
Yeah.
You know, I recognize Vancouver, and it's got Seattle written on it.
Right.
Yeah, not Seattle. Not in Kansas anymore. All right. Couple of questions have come in, but I want some more. So get going out there. And I'll end with maybe an impossible question. No, I guess it's not impossible to answer this question if I phrase it this way. Do you see any hope? Do you have any hope that as a species, we're evolving, or will we forever be driven by power and greed and hatred of the other? There you go. Simple little ending question for you there.
I think we have to have some hope. I'm not sure how realistic it is. I mean, we often do seem to go, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or maybe 1 step forward, 2 steps back. It certainly is, a complicated dance. But I think the only way to approach it is with hope, because I think otherwise that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Hope is what motivates people to do various things. And I know, for example, in Belarus, one of the things they do now in modern day Belarus pays tribute to the people that were killed at Kuropatki. So in Belarus, they have this holiday, the Day of the Dead, 1 day a year, where they invite all the dead relatives to come in for dinner to their houses. And so they open all the doors and windows, and they put out special food, barley porridge and blini and sweets and eggs and things like that. And they call the dead by name. They call their relatives by name, and they bring them in. And they have, it's not sort of spooky the way we think about it in North America. It's much more companionable. And so they have a lovely dinner with their relatives. And then at the end of the dinner, at the end of the night, the spirits of their relatives return to the everlasting. And if there's one that doesn't want to return, they get swept out with a broom. But now in modern day Belarus, on this holiday, it's called Dziady, there is a march that goes to Kuropatki. And in part, it's a way of honoring the dead at Kuropatki. And in part, it's a protest, of course, against the modern day regime in Belarus. But I think that kind of thing makes it makes me feel that there, is some possibility of hope.
I love that. I love that story so much. I'm not sure about evolution. I am sure about hope. And I feel that what happens is maybe we have shifting consciousnesses through time. So an example from that I discovered and worked on with this book was that, whereas in the Iliad, you could have one of the great poets of the age writing that the general is exhorting the soldiers, do not head for the boats until you have bedded a faithful Trojan wife. So this general exhorting soldiers to go and rape. 2,000 years later, we have an internationally agreed upon criminal court that says this is a crime not against women, but against humanity, against all of us. And so this is like the kind of shifting of consciousness in the same way that the Earth is no longer the center of the solar system. Now we don't even believe that our solar system is the center. It's bigger. I think that our kind of consciousness kind of pulses, and we get different takes on it as successive generations are in the world.
So, what I hear you saying is that there's the microcosm of current events, and then there's the broader view over time of how much things have and can change.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Well, okay, let's get to the questions. And here's the first one. After such serious books, what topics are, well, I think Judith touched on this a little bit, saying she's going in another direction. What topics are you considering for the next book or books?
I had originally thought, in my family, I won't get more specific than that, there is in past generations, there have been a number of con artists. I don't know if this is related to being a writer at some point, but anyway. So I was thinking of exploring some of them, but I started writing, and then the story kind of corkscrewed off in a completely different direction. So I don't know where it'll end up.
Man, I look at American politics and these days, and they're all con artists. I mean,
Yeah, that's true.
something happens and a bunch of people come in and just drain the suckers for every penny they can. It's crazy.
Yeah, I don't know. I want to write a love story, but I'll start with a love story, and then it always kind of shifts off. So we'll see what happens.
and bearing in mind that lots of writers, for very good reasons, don't want to talk too much about works in progress or ideas, because things change and things,
change.
you know, you could sit there and say, well, I'm going to do this, and boom, you're somewhere else in 6 months. So it's a tough one. Were there perpetrator accounts from the Stalinist era that were used as the basis for the Singing Forest?
Mostly I used stories or the research of Professor Lynn Viola at the Monk Center at UT. And so they weren't perpetrator accounts necessarily. They were mostly just descriptions, and a lot of it was the NKVD, the Stalin secret police in the Ukraine. But my understanding was that was, it was very similar to what they did in Belarus and some of the other places. So no, they weren't necessarily
not a lot of documentation.
Yeah, and well, not a lot of first-person documentation. Yeah. And so that was a challenge, and I certainly understand what Kim is saying about how to make that authentic. I think I just tried to do that in the way that you do with any character, getting inside them and inhabiting them, and having some some compassion for them, not too much, but having some understanding of them, and hoping that presents as a live person and an authentic and true person.
This next question is about, it's interesting, it's entirely different direction kind of thing. And the question was specifically about the cover of Judith's book, but I really want to make it about both books. And of course, people are not going to be able to see very well these beautiful, beautiful covers. And I know that the whole, this is an advanced reader's copy, so I don't know if it looks exactly the same as the finished copy. Yeah. And I know that the covers are really, I was in the Quillen Choir, they used to do that series where they would show the designers' development. I loved that. You'd see the changing concept as they accepted and rejected. And quite often, the writer doesn't hold a ton of sway about the covers, but what would you say about your covers, Kim?
I was very, very pleased when I saw this cover. I was a little bit worried that there was the potential to go in the direction of too much darkness. And I mean, one of the things about this book is that it's about people who care for each other, whether they're in the former Yugoslavia or in Toronto or in Vienna, and particularly women caring for each other, women caring for each other through generations, and so on. So the use of the flower and the connectedness and the evocation of nature and so on, I was very pleased with that. I thought it caught the feeling tone of the book actually much better than if they had focused on the trials.
And it's visually so beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Judith.
first of all, I can't speak too highly of Biblioasis, my publisher. They were wonderful. They still are wonderful. And they came up with 3 designs for the book and sent them to me and asked me, if I was interested in any of them. I think if I hadn't been interested in any of them, I might have been able to say that, but fortunately I was the one that that ultimately made it to the cover. And then they put up with me saying, but could you do a little of this and a little of that? And they were very patient about that, very kind. But it was really them and their people that came up with this.
Cool.
And I loved it.
All right, just a couple more and we have enough time, I think, to deal with them. So to you both, how were you able to leave your stories behind when you were finished? Did you, Judith, you talked about sort of circumscribing the writing process in chunks, if I can put it that way. But when it was all said and done, did you take a trip? Las Vegas, Hawaii, I don't know. Or did you just kind of, were you already, sometimes writers are already working on the next thing or just writing, it's like exercises, Mm-hmm. So was there a break period of any kind?
Well, I have been to Belarus, I should say, but
Yes.
It was before, not after. Well, I have to say that I'm a, chronic reviser. And so I must have revised that book, 30 or 40 times. But I stopped revising the affidavits because I just couldn't stand it. So I would skip over that part and then obsess about some word, before and after. But I tried not to revisit the difficult things. But then, there is some advantage to being a lawyer in the sense that you are constantly presented often with very difficult stories, particularly refugee lawyers, for example. And so, you do have to build some distance, a bit of a buffer there between you and your clients. And so, I was able to draw on some of that, not a lot, because however much you try and develop some professional thick skin, the reality is these stories are so terrible that they're going to get to you. But in terms of moving on, certainly the idea that I'm not writing another book like this was helpful. I guess just, I don't really know. Kim, what did you do? I mean, some of it was just, trying to not stay in that place, trying to move on.
And I don't mean to kind of harp on travel because there are lots of other ways to decompress, distract yourself, give yourself a break, sitting in your own living room, reading other books, whatever it may be. But I do get the sense, Kim, that you do travel a fair amount anyway.
Yes, I have it although when I was finishing this book, the process of finishing a book is quite long too, because you have your initial edits and then you have your copy edits and then you have the final edits. So it takes longer than sometimes people imagine. And when I was going through that process, the pandemic hit. So, from the joys of jumping on an airplane when I could, I was back in my garden shed.
Which is where you are now.
Which is where I am now.
It doesn't look like a shed.
It's all illusion now.
You don't do much gardening. You do a lot of reading.
I don't actually, there's no garden tools in here. That's a problem, isn't it? Wait, I'm going to show you something.
Yes, please.
I do have garden tools here. See?
Oh! Excellent. Secateurs and gardening gloves.
I don't know. I mean, I don't think you actually leave your stories behind. You're holding them in maybe less intense forms, but you're holding them.
Mhm.
And then people want to tell you their stories once they've read sometimes your fiction. And so I don't think they really get left behind. I think you're with them. They're with you.
Right.
Yeah.
Last question is directed at Judith. Can you talk about the decision to insert the passages about glass that punctuate the singing forest?
Yes, for sure. I mean, one of the things about glass is it's what they call an amorphous solid, which means that it's not really a solid and it's not really a liquid. Because of course, when it's heated up, it stops being hard and so forth, and then it hardens up. And that seemed to me, something of a metaphor for a lot of things in the book, the issues of memory and what is truth, and the mutability of a variety of different things, identity and so forth. And so that was part of it. But I also have a twin sister who was a glass blower early on in her career. She became a filmmaker originally. But so I used to go and see her. She was down at Harbourfront for a while. I was always sort of fascinated by it. And in fact, I took a workshop at one point a few years ago, where a hot glass workshop, so that just because I was so fascinated by it. So that's, that part of that that's why it emerged as a theme.
Yeah, when you go down to Harbourfront, at least in the old days, I don't know what it's like now, but you could watch the glass blowers. They were right there, just off a hallway in an open space, and you can on Granville Island in Vancouver too. You can watch the glass blowing. I think people are just absolutely fascinated by blowing glass. Like mine would just explode every time, like a bubble gum. Bang. Well, you guys are absolutely amazing because we've pulled this out completely on time. It's been absorbing and illuminating, and I would encourage, again, with the live events, you could always just point to the book table at the back. Ara did mention that you can buy books probably with a simple click on a link. So I would definitely encourage everybody to pick up a copy of each book, and together they'll give you a really complete and fulfilling experience. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hal. That was lovely.
Ara's back.
Yes. Thank you all so much. What a beautiful collection of books and great conversation. And yes, as Hal mentioned, we do have our festival bookseller has always been Novel Idea Books here in Kingston. So if you would like to pick up copies of The Singing Forest or Speak Silence, they are available through their store, online, or by phone. And you can find the links for that on our website, or just look up Novel Idea. We do have a winner of a copy of the books, and that is Janet Swetman. So if you want to email info@kingstonwritersfest.ca, we will get those out to you. Once again, I really want to thank you all for joining us. I'm sorry this can't be in person, but what a pleasure to hear from you all. And there are still 2 more days of the festival to come. And so check out the lineup at kingstonwritersfest.ca, and we hope to see you there.